It was December 1944, and most of the Allied High Command in Europe was convinced that victory was only weeks away. There was a sense of calm, almost smug confidence spreading through the war rooms in London and Paris. Maps were studied, plans were drawn, and celebrations of the inevitable defeat of Hitler's forces were quietly anticipated. To many generals, the Ardennes forest in Belgium seemed like a quiet, unthreatening sector. It was considered the backwater of the front, a place where nothing dramatic could happen. And yet, one man saw danger lurking where no one else dared to look. George Patton had a reputation. He was bold, brash, and often unpredictable, but beneath the tough exterior was a mind constantly scanning for threats, constantly anticipating the enemy's moves. While others relaxed, Patton's eyes were fixed on the terrain, on the deployment of German forces, and on intelligence reports that seemed to suggest something was amiss. He noticed odd patterns, strange gaps, movements that didn't add up. Units that had been in place for weeks suddenly vanished. Supplies were being shifted in ways that didn't match routine maneuvers. To everyone else, it was inconsequential. To Patton, it was a warning. Every other commander dismissed him. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, was focused on the bigger picture, the march into Germany, the liberation of France, the end game everyone wanted to believe was coming. Bradley, Patton's direct superior, nodded politely when Patton raised concerns, calling them exaggerations or overthinking. Even the intelligence officers, who were used to parsing complex and sometimes contradictory reports, seemed to shrug off the anomalies. And yet Patton did not. He began to prepare quietly, without fanfare. Troops were put on alert, vehicles were checked, fuel supplies counted, and routes rehearsed. Patton's staff wondered if he had lost touch with reality. They worried about the morale of the men if they seemed to be preparing for a disaster that might never come. Patton ignored the doubts. He had seen patterns in previous campaigns, subtle shifts in enemy behavior that most generals would overlook, and he trusted his instincts. It was not paranoia. Patton had already witnessed the consequences of underestimating the enemy. He remembered Normandy, where the German defenses had seemed fractured but were capable of lethal counterattacks. He remembered the months in France when minor lapses had cost lives and opportunities. Patton had learned that wars are won not when victory seems guaranteed, but when danger is anticipated and met before it arrives. As the days of December ticked by, reports continued to arrive. Intelligence suggested that German forces were moving in unusual ways, but no one drew the connections. Numbers didn't make sense. Divisions that should have been at the front lines were suddenly absent. The calculations suggested an impossible scenario, a massive German force mobilizing under the radar. Patton read the reports and immediately understood what it meant. He saw the potential for a massive strike at the weakest point in the Allied line. If he was right, the consequences would be catastrophic. And still, the reactions around him were skeptical. Generals spoke in calm, measured tones, confident that even if there were anomalies, the Germans were too depleted to attempt anything significant. The war was winding down, they said. There was no way Hitler could launch a major offensive. But Patton refused to listen to reassurance. He knew the man he was up against, and he knew desperation could make an enemy unpredictable. Every morning, Patton walked through his headquarters, eyes scanning maps, reports, and conversations. He drilled his staff, asking questions that seemed irrelevant, but each one was designed to prepare them for what might come. Fuel convoys, troop movements, artillery placements, all were double-checked. Men noticed the unusual intensity of the drills, but they trusted their general. They knew that when Patton prepared, it was always for something real, even if no one else could see it. By December 15th, the tension was palpable, but still invisible to the rest of the command. While Eisenhower and Bradley held meetings discussing the next steps in Europe, Patton had already made mental plans for a counterattack that would require moving an entire army hundreds of miles in the matter of days.
It seemed impossible, even reckless. But Patton knew that if his predictions were correct, speed and preparation were the only things that could prevent disaster. No one around him understood the stakes, and yet Patton carried the weight alone. He had a habit of speaking plainly, sometimes brusquely, and he made it clear that he would take action if needed. He did not wait for permission, but he hoped it would never come to that. Deep down, he sensed that this would be a test, not just of his leadership, but of the very fabric of Allied strategy. In the quiet hours before the storm, Patton's mind was already at the front lines. He imagined the forest paths, the icy rivers, the frozen roads through Belgium. He considered supply chains, the fatigue of his soldiers, the fury of the German counterattack he expected. And he understood something crucial. When the world assumes victory is certain, it is the danger no one sees that strikes the hardest. Patton's intuition was about to be put to the ultimate test. The Ardennes was about to erupt in a way that would shock the Allies and almost change the course of the war. But in that moment, before the first shot was fired, Patton was the only man in the room who truly understood what was coming, and the only one ready to act when it did.
By mid-December, the Ardennes sector, still considered quiet by most, began to reveal unsettling signs. Reports from the front lines noted something strange. Entire German divisions seemed to vanish without explanation. Colonel Koch, an intelligence officer working with the Allies, made a startling discovery. 15 panzer divisions, armored units that had been spotted for months, were nowhere to be found. No routine movement, no redeployment orders, just gone. To most commanders, it was curious, perhaps a clerical error. To Patton, it was a warning siren. He studied the numbers carefully, cross-referencing reports, maps, and aerial reconnaissance. Something was happening, and it was massive. The sheer scale of what these missing units represented was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of seasoned German soldiers, equipped with tanks, artillery, and vehicles, had been removed from their usual positions and were moving in secrecy. Patton understood immediately that this was not defensive repositioning. It was preparation for an offensive. And not just any offensive, the kind that could strike a lethal blow at the weakest point of the Allied front. Patton wasted no time. He summoned his staff and walked them through the data, pointing to gaps, movement patterns, and supply lines that indicated an extraordinary buildup. "Look at this," he said, voice calm but firm. "The Germans are concentrating forces here, and they are planning something big." He emphasized speed, surprise, and the likelihood that their attack would come in a place no one expected. He instructed officers to prepare every unit for rapid mobilization, to ready fuel, ammunition, and vehicles for movement under severe winter conditions. Every small detail mattered, and Patton wanted them ready for anything. He then made the rounds to the higher command, briefing General Omar Bradley and even writing directly to Eisenhower. He explained the missing divisions, the potential target areas, and the risk to the entire Allied line. "They're going to hit the Ardennes," warned Patton. "It's the weakest sector. They want to split our armies, and if we're not ready, they could collapse this entire front." He pressed the urgency, knowing that every hour counted. The response was frustrating. Eisenhower, confident in the overall strength of the Allies, regarded the warnings with polite skepticism. Bradley nodded but dismissed the predictions as overly cautious. Other commanders echoed the sentiment. Patton's reputation for aggression and sometimes reckless tactics worked against him. They assumed he was imagining scenarios to justify bold moves. Reports were filed, maps were marked, but no one acted with the urgency Patton demanded. Meanwhile, Patton continued his preparations quietly. Supplies were stockpiled, units drilled for rapid deployment, and routes across frozen roads were scouted and rehearsed.
He ensured that fuel depots were secured, artillery positioned for immediate movement, and communication lines were robust. To the casual observer, it seemed like routine maintenance, but in truth, it was a full-scale readiness program designed for an attack that could happen at any moment. Patton's men began to understand that their general was preparing for a nightmare scenario that no one else could see. As December 15th approached, Patton's foresight became even more critical. German movements suggested imminent action. Snow covered the roads, masking the advance of mechanized units. German columns, unseen by aerial surveillance due to clever camouflage, crept closer to the front lines. Patton's mind raced through every detail, confirming that his predictions were not exaggerations, they were imminent reality. The Ardennes was about to erupt, and the scale of destruction promised to be staggering. In those hours, before the first artillery shells fell, Patton stood apart from the rest of the Allied command. While others debated logistics or dismissed rumors, Patton knew exactly what was coming. The largest offensive of the war, meticulously planned and boldly executed, was about to strike the weakest point of the Allied line. And while most generals were unprepared, Patton's army, quietly readied through days of anticipation and foresight, would be the only force capable of responding.
December 16th arrived like a shock wave through the Ardennes. The morning was bitterly cold, snow blanketing the forests and winding roads, hiding the movements that would soon shake the Allied front to its core. For most of the Allied commanders, the day began like any other, with reports to review, maps to study, and routine patrol updates. Yet for Patton, the signs were unmistakable. The enemy had moved. The divisions he had tracked disappearing days before had arrived at the staging areas, ready to strike. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. Artillery thundered across the frozen hills, and the ground seemed to tremble under the weight of mechanized German columns. Blitzkrieg, the very tactic that had conquered Europe in 1940, was unleashed once again. Tanks rolled through snow-laden forests, infantry advanced with ruthless precision, and the initial strikes tore through the thin defenses of the 106th Infantry Division. Entire units were overrun before they could even properly respond. The scale of the attack stunned everyone. 400,000 German soldiers had launched what would become the largest offensive in Western Europe since D-Day. The Ardennes, previously considered a quiet sector, turned into a killing field. Patton's predictions were being validated in real time, and the destruction around him confirmed what he had known all along. Complacency could be fatal. The 106th Infantry, stationed along the northern edge of the sector, faced the brunt of the assault. These soldiers, many of them new to combat and inexperienced in winter warfare, were quickly surrounded. Communications disrupted, artillery support delayed, and panic spread through the ranks. Thousands of men found themselves cut off, isolated in the snow, with German tanks and infantry pressing relentlessly from all sides. Within days, the division suffered what would become the worst mass surrender in American history since the Civil War. Meanwhile, in the headquarters of the higher Allied command, disbelief and confusion reigned. Reports from the front lines were chaotic, contradictory, and alarming. Commanders struggled to piece together the scope of the offensive. Eisenhower and Bradley, once confident in the security of the Ardennes, realized the magnitude of the threat. But for many, it was already too late. Entire regiments were encircled, and the front line was collapsing faster than any previous prediction could have imagined. In contrast, Patton had anticipated this exact scenario. He had studied the terrain, calculated the time it would take for German forces to reach key junctions, and prepared countermeasures in advance. When word came that Bastogne, the small Belgian town at the center of the advance, was surrounded, he knew that speed would be the only solution.
The Third Army, under his command, was already ready to mobilize, trucks and tanks prepped, soldiers briefed, and routes cleared through the frozen landscape. As the German offensive progressed, the intensity of combat escalated. Snowstorms made visibility nearly zero, freezing roads slowed movement, and the harsh winter created a battlefield that tested both human endurance and machinery. Tanks stalled in icy mud, men suffered frostbite, and supply lines became a nightmare. Yet the German advance, while overwhelming, was not invincible. The meticulous planning and foresight of Patton's preparations meant that a rapid counterattack was still possible, even under impossible conditions. Back at Bastogne, surrounded American forces fought desperately. Artillery shells landed with deadly accuracy, streets and forests filled with smoke and fire, and every hour seemed to bring another wave of attacks. Yet even as morale faltered, reports reached Patton that some units were holding out longer than expected. His mind raced, analyzing how best to deploy his forces to break the siege. Every detail he had prepared for, the fuel, the routes, the coordination of infantry, armor, and artillery, was about to be put to the ultimate test. The scale of the German gamble was breathtaking. Hitler had thrown everything he could muster at the Ardennes, hoping to split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. But in doing so, he had concentrated a massive force into a vulnerable corridor, relying on speed and surprise to succeed. Patton understood that if he acted quickly, he could exploit the overextension, cut the enemy off, and stabilize the front. But time was slipping with every passing hour, and the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers hung in the balance. For the first time, many commanders finally began to grasp the truth. The Ardennes was not quiet. The German army had struck with unprecedented ferocity. Entire divisions were destroyed, towns were under siege, and the fate of the Western Front was uncertain. Yet, in the midst of the chaos, one general remained calm, focused, and resolute. Patton had seen this coming. He had prepared for it. And now, as the snow fell and the guns roared, the Third Army would move faster and farther than anyone thought possible. The opening hours of the Battle of the Bulge were catastrophic, but they also set the stage for the extraordinary actions that would follow. Patton's foresight, intelligence, and determination were the only things that stood between total disaster and the eventual stabilization of the front. While most Allied commanders were scrambling, reacting, and questioning every report, Patton was already enacting the plans he had laid in the cold weeks before. Every decision, every movement, and every calculation would prove crucial in the coming days as the Ardennes became the bloodiest battlefield American forces had ever faced.
The morning after the German offensive began, the situation in the Ardennes was grim. Snow blanketed the forests, roads were icy and treacherous, and American units were struggling to hold their ground. Bastogne, a small Belgian town, had become the focal point of the German assault. Surrounded on all sides, its defenders were under constant artillery fire and facing severe shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Morale wavered, and the enemy seemed unstoppable. But across the front, one general refused to panic. Patton knew that speed and decisiveness were the only tools that could turn the tide. Patton's plan was audacious, almost reckless in its scale. He would move nearly 100,000 soldiers with tanks, trucks, artillery, and support units over 90 miles of icy, snow-clogged roads in just 48 hours. Logistics alone would have crushed most armies. Fuel had to be rationed, vehicles maintained in freezing temperatures, and supply lines coordinated with precision. Bridges had to be crossed and narrow forest roads navigated without delay. For many, it seemed impossible. For Patton, it was the only way to save the front. From the first hours, the Third Army began its movement. Convoys snaked through the snow-covered countryside, engines rumbling against the icy resistance of the roads. Patton rode along with his staff, monitoring progress, making adjustments, and pushing drivers and commanders alike to maintain pace. Every delay could cost lives. Every misstep could allow the Germans to consolidate their gains. Yet Patton's meticulous planning made the impossible achievable. Routes were cleared ahead of time, fuel dumps strategically positioned, and radio communications kept every unit synchronized. As the Third Army advanced, the weather became a relentless adversary. Blizzards reduced visibility to a few feet, snowdrifts blocked roads, tanks bogged down in mud and ice, and trucks carrying supplies had to be pulled free again and again. Men worked around the clock, often exhausted, sometimes frostbitten, but Patton's presence inspired them. He was relentless, moving between units, issuing orders with a combination of authority and confidence that left no doubt he expected them to succeed. Meanwhile, the defenders in Bastogne were clinging to life. The 101st Airborne, surrounded on all sides, held their positions against repeated attacks, relying on ingenuity and courage to survive. Artillery shells pounded their defenses, supply shortages grew critical, and yet they resisted every attempt to break through. News of Patton's approaching forces arrived in fragments. Morale surged with every report of tanks rolling closer, every column of trucks that made it through the snow. Patton's advance was not without peril. German forces had anticipated some form of counterattack, and pockets of resistance had been left to slow the Americans. Ambushes along narrow roads, mines hidden under snow, and sudden attacks by mobile German units threatened to stall the movement. But Patton's planning accounted for these risks. Forward scouts cleared roads, engineers repaired bridges in record time, and artillery units provided suppressive fire to keep enemy forces off balance. Every obstacle was met with calculated force, and every decision was made with the speed that the moment demanded. By the second day, the Third Army had closed the distance at an almost unbelievable pace. Units that would normally take a week to move had covered the 90-mile route in just 48 hours. Soldiers pushed through exhaustion, driven by the urgency of saving the men in Bastogne and by the force of Patton's leadership. Every town crossed, every forest navigated, brought them closer to the besieged defenders, and every mile reinforced the idea that preparation and decisiveness could overcome even the most daunting circumstances. Finally, as the morning of December 26th dawned, the vanguard of Patton's forces reached Bastogne. Relief was immediate and overwhelming. The defenders, battered and surrounded, were finally able to resupply and regroup. German forces, which had counted on rapid victory, found themselves facing a reinforced front, with the Third Army now positioned to strike back. The balance of the Ardennes shifted in a single decisive action, a combination of foresight, discipline, and audacity that only a general like Patton could have executed. The relief of Bastogne was more than a tactical victory. It was a testament to the power of preparation, intuition, and leadership under pressure. While other commanders had been paralyzed by disbelief and confusion, Patton had anticipated the threat, read the enemy's intentions, and acted decisively when it mattered most. Every detail, from fuel management to route selection, from troop morale to artillery coordination, had been executed flawlessly under conditions that seemed impossible. In those long, freezing hours, Patton transformed chaos into opportunity. The German offensive, which had begun with overwhelming momentum, now faced an enemy capable of responding with equal speed and precision. Bastogne held, the front stabilized, and the Third Army's movement became a legendary example of operational excellence. And through it all, Patton remained focused, never wavering, never doubting that his preparation would pay off. The Ardennes winter had tested the limits of endurance, strategy, and leadership. Yet in the heart of the storm, Patton's vision turned impending disaster into a controlled, decisive action. The stage was set for the final days of the battle, where determination, courage, and relentless pursuit of opportunity would define the outcome.
The largest offensive of the war had been blunted, and the lesson was clear. When one general sees what others cannot, he can achieve the impossible.
The snow finally began to relent, but the cold and the devastation remained. The Ardennes forest, once quiet and overlooked, had been transformed into a battlefield of unimaginable scale. Towns were reduced to rubble, roads churned to mud, and the frozen rivers were lined with the remnants of tanks and vehicles abandoned in the rush of combat. Thousands of soldiers were dead or wounded, and the toll of the largest German offensive in Western Europe was staggering. Yet in the midst of this chaos, one general emerged unscathed, not physically perhaps, but strategically and morally unshaken. George Patton had been vindicated. The German offensive, ambitious and desperate, had failed to achieve its objectives. Antwerp remained in Allied hands, the front line was stabilized, and the siege of Bastogne had been broken. Patton's rapid counterattack had not only relieved the trapped defenders, but had also disrupted German plans, forcing them to react rather than continue their advance. Every move he had anticipated, every preparation he had insisted upon, had been validated by the outcome. While many Allied commanders had been caught off guard, Patton had turned foresight into action and saved countless lives in the process. Eisenhower, always calm and measured, could no longer dismiss Patton's capabilities. In private, he acknowledged that Patton was the only general in the European theater whom he had never worried about. While others required constant monitoring, reassurances, and second-guessing, Patton acted with certainty and precision. His intuition, combined with meticulous planning, had turned what could have been a catastrophic defeat into a controlled and decisive response. It was a rare recognition from a commander known for his discretion and careful judgment, and it underscored the unique nature of Patton's leadership. But the story of Patton's foresight was not simply one of numbers and movements. It was also a story of human resilience. The soldiers of the Third Army, inspired and disciplined, had followed a plan that seemed impossible, moving across frozen roads, navigating blizzards, and facing constant threats from the enemy. Their success reflected Patton's ability to instill confidence, inspire courage, and demand excellence under the harshest conditions. It was a leadership that combined foresight with action, courage with preparation, and intuition with calculation. The broader lessons of the Battle of the Bulge were also clear. Complacency, even in the face of apparent victory, can be fatal. Intelligence can be overlooked, misinterpreted, or ignored, and yet the attentive, proactive leader can change the course of events. Patton's insistence on vigilance, his refusal to accept assumptions without evidence, and his willingness to act decisively made the difference between disaster and triumph. In an army of thousands, it only took one man to anticipate the enemy and prepare his forces to respond effectively. In the days following the relief of Bastogne, Patton's reputation grew. Reports of his audacious maneuver spread across the front, reaching the ears of soldiers, commanders, and civilians alike. The Third Army's movement became a case study in speed, efficiency, and leadership under extreme conditions. Historians would later call it one of the most remarkable operational feats of the Second World War. Yet for Patton, it was not about recognition, it was about responsibility. The duty to foresee danger, to prepare, and to act when others hesitated. Even as the battle subsided, the memory of those critical days remained vivid. The Ardennes had tested the limits of human endurance, strategy, and leadership. It had revealed the consequences of ignoring warning signs and the extraordinary results of anticipating them. Patton had done both. He had read the enemy's intentions, prepared for the impossible, and acted with speed and precision. In doing so, he had not only saved the front, but had also cemented his place in military history as a commander who combined courage, intelligence, and intuition in ways few others could.
The legacy of those days is as much about foresight as it is about action. Modern military planners study Patton's movements, his rapid response, and his ability to inspire troops under extreme conditions. The Battle of the Bulge serves as a stark reminder that wars are not won by complacency, by assumption, or by routine. They are won by those who see what others cannot, who act when others hesitate, and who understand that preparation is the greatest form of power. As the snow melted and the Allied forces pressed into Germany, the echoes of Patton's decisions continued to shape the campaign. The men he had saved, the towns he had preserved, and the momentum he had restored all bore witness to a simple truth. In war, foresight saves lives, decisiveness creates victories, and a single general who refuses to be blind to danger can alter the course of history. By the end of December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge was no longer just a story of destruction. It was a story of redemption, preparation, and extraordinary leadership. Patton had been the only general to foresee the German attack, the only one ready when it came, and the only one whose actions turned near catastrophe into a strategic triumph. His legacy from those days endures not merely in military history, but in every lesson about vigilance, courage, and the power of anticipating the unimaginable.